There
We
you
did
are.
it. We
We
did it
did it.
again.
I know it took a little bit, but I think that's like the hardest part of the whole deal.
The rest of this is so easy, and that is seems to be such a challenge. I don't know what.
I think it says a lot about our
Your your
technical,
your age, honestly,
my age,
your age
my technical abilities.
and age.
Uh-huh. And yours is what? Considering
You,
you have a
you
birthday coming up real soon here.
I do 34. Can you believe it?
34. Okay. Uh-huh. We'll go with 34.
Okay.
Hey, so hey, for I think most of you know me, I'm Stephanie Bessent, and I am joined with my good friend, mentor, and in some regards, person that saved Tony's and my marriage and life, and that was 10 years ago now.
Wow.
Super, gosh, just so thankful. I mean, just so thankful
Mm,
that could not imagine that 10 years ago that we been be sitting here.
mm,
Um, Phil is in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He works for Sage Hill Counseling and has just done lots of restorative care with lots of people through the years, myself included, which sent me on a path to eventually be doing this on my own or here in Lawrence, Kansas, and helping people. And I remember one of the things, Phil, that when I very first came and talked to you guys, and you guys were doing these lectures, and you started talking about the difference between hurt and harm. And I was
mm,
like, it's okay for people to hurt me. It's not okay for people to harm me. I'm so confused. I don't get what that means. And now I realize as I'm walking with people, they come up with the same things where it's like, I don't understand the difference between hurt and harm. So let's start off with hurt. Can you tell me about hurt?
yeah. Boy, can I ever? No. Hurt is it's an intensely relational feeling. There's a proverb. I actually pulled it up here so I don't butcher it. It's a Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." And that's one twist on hurt we don't really hear very often, but the word hurt really means to wound. It means to pierce or to bore through. So think about a sword or like an auger or a drill drilling through your abdomen. So both of those things would really hurt physically. And so when we talk about hurt in this context relationally, we're talking about how we can really wound one another. And so, Steph, you've heard this many times. Some listening may have heard it many times too, but with the advent of spectrometer scans in medicine and science, neuroscience, they began to look at the emotional life limbically, or what happens in the brain. And they found out this incredible thing. If you think back to the euphemisms we use in the English language to describe emotional pain, like slap in the face, a punch in the gut, stab in the back, run over by a train, broken hearted. We have all these phrases we use. And if you think about what those phrases mean, like, ouch, that would really hurt to get stabbed in the back. That would really physically hurt to get slapped in the face. Well, they found out with spectrometer scans, looking at the brain, this was the functional MRIs and spectrometer scans, like this is your brain on drugs and what lights up. And they found out that the brain lights up in the same place when we experience physical pain as it does when we experience emotional pain. So sometimes we'll say, oh, it hurts so bad. It literally hurts. My stomach is hurting. My bones are hurting. And there's all through the scriptures there, David says in Psalm 32, it's like my bones wasted away when I kept silent. He was hurt, wounded.
Hmm.
And that was self-inflicted, by the way, harm. So it's crazy, this crazy feeling hurt. It's located in the place in the limbic brain that registers real live pain, real live woundedness. And so that puts opioid addiction, for example, in some pretty perspective. Like people will take opioids to deal with the pain of a broken ankle, and they'll take opioid with the pain of a broken heart, because the
Hmm.
limbic brain doesn't know the difference between the two. So it gets literally down into our physiology when we talk about hurt in relationship. Like it hurts to the bone. We've been hurt. And so the idea of hurt sometimes has a connotation of it's always negative or always bad or always something you don't want to do. And the writer of Proverbs, I'll read it again, it's in the ESV, it said, faithful are the wounds of a friend. It goes on to say, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. I was talking about deception and manipulation. But the first part of that verse, faithful are the wounds of a friend, you would think, gosh, how in the world could that be faithful? How can that help? And there's a difference between hurting someone and harming someone. You know my story. I won't repeat the whole context, but one of the most impactful conversations I've ever had, two of them actually, were where I exited them feeling profound hurt. I had a professor that was paying attention. I was languishing in college at northeastern Oklahoma State in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. It taken me forever to get through school because I was just really a sick guy. And I was going to be a doctor, I thought. He called me out and he hurt me because he looked at me and he said, you're no good at math and science. You don't know what you're doing. Like you're good at other things. And so, you know, the details of that story, but that conversation hurt deeply, but he did not harm me. He told me the truth about what he saw in me. And it completely, that conversation in 1986-ish, 84, 85-ish, had everything to do with this conversation we're having tonight. It set me on a course of pursuing psychology and theology and healing, that the current road I was on, I would not have gotten off of it probably unless this man named Dr. George Nolan in Tahlequah, Oklahoma had not been willing to say something to me that I would feel hurt about.
Yes. So go ahead.
Well, the other one was my own wife, Sheila, when she was pregnant and we had our here's what the gender is sonogram. It was a boy. And she told me in a very painful conversation, she goes, I have great fear that if this boy is born and he doesn't love sports, baseball in particular, if he loves books or music or something else like that, that you won't accept him. You'll reject him. Mm-hmm. Man, that hurt so deeply, and it so affected in a very positive way how I parented that son, who's getting married 3 weeks from now, 26 years old. And so I have two very powerful, literally life-changing conversations that I left feeling profoundly hurt, but they were faithful wounds from people who loved me. And so yes, hurt doesn't mean harm, and it doesn't mean bad. Hurt just simply means I have hurt or experienced something that got a wound in. And in those two conversations, what was wounded was my pride more than anything. What was wounded was my lack of direction, floundering around in college trying to be a doctor when I didn't have the aptitude for math or science to get that done.
Yes. So in a very loving way, a friend or somebody who sees something in you can stand in the way of, or as we talk about, confrontation, and speak the truth of what it's like to be in a relationship with another person. And just because I'm sharing my experience of that other person with them, it does not mean that I'm harming them, that I can be extremely loving and extremely kind and extremely wanting the best from them. And they may feel hurt. And it does not mean that I have done anything wrong if that person feels hurt.
Yeah. I mean, most of the feedback I've ever received, I felt hurt about. And most of the feedback I received, I needed to hear.
Sure. But likewise, absolutely the same. And the most growth that I've had, when I'm willing to hear somebody who loves me and cares about me and is willing to confront me, I may feel deep hurt about it, but knowing my relationship with that individual and person and their willingness to confront me and my trust in them too. Like I can go and hear from you sometimes and go, okay, Phil's not meaning to be harmful to me. I may feel deeply wounded, but that has to do with my own story, that I may feel hurt about what's being said. But out of that, when I can really slow down and stop and go, okay, what's being said here? It can cause just a tremendous amount of growth. And that does say a bit about the relationship that we have with another when someone has that amount of space to speak into our lives as well.
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the things, and we've talked about it before on Instagram Live, and we've talked about it hundreds of times in private and just regular conversations that this feeling in particular, this feeling called hurt, if people in marriages, business partnerships, friendships, um, cooperation on a work team, you name it. If human beings, if we could increase our bandwidth and our ability to deal with hurt, it would go millions of miles in keeping relationships together and truth telling. And we've talked about on here before, Steph. And you've got a burgeoning teenager and another one right behind her in your house, and I've raised one, and we're all familiar with, generally speaking, what it's like to share space with an adolescent. And often adolescents will say things because their limbic brains or prefrontal lobe is forming, and they don't really know how to say what they're wanting to say, especially if the conversation has to do with any level of intimacy whatsoever. And so it's so easy for a parent to go, well, they're shutting down on me, they're shutting me out, they don't care about me, they're selfish, they're self-absorbed, they're all that stuff. Where if the parent would just take a step back and deal with their hurt of their child not speaking to them like they want to be spoken to. I'm not talking about disrespect and no boundaries. I mean, in terms of sometimes when a teenager is silent and not speaking, he or she does not know how to say what they're wanting to say. The limbic brains are screaming something and they can't say it. They don't know what to say. And so if a parent can take a step back and just deal with the hurt of what's happening and continue pursuing that child or pursuing that spouse or pursuing that partner in ministry or whatever the relationship is, if we would deal with hurt and continue pursuing relationship, it would make a huge difference in how relationships become estranged.
Absolutely, because as you and I have talked about before, the whole idea of containment is like if I can acknowledge any of my feelings, but in this instance, if I can acknowledge my hurt and remain present, then my child can have a come apart and me be okay and not be threatened by them or not take it personally or not like to know that they're in the struggle of life and they feel safe in showing up with me in that struggle. And if I can acknowledge, hey, what's going on with me, that I'm feeling hurt, that I can still be present with them and not have to take it out on them either. Because once I take it out on them, now I'm harming. So
Yes.
let's circle around here and go, hey, let's talk about harm.
Well, once again, we're gonna, excuse me, the drain we're gonna circle. We're gonna circle the drain of feelings. We have to, in order to be able to put some kind of construct around what we're talking about. So we know the feeling of hurt is that feeling that lets me know that I've been wounded. And it may be the wounds of a friend, but I know I've been wounded. That's what I know. And if I will deal with it, we've talked about it on here, identify, explore, and express that hurt. Express it to someone safe, explore what the hurt's about, identify it as hurt. We'll move into this territory. One of the outcomes will be this idea that we will have healing and courage. We'll have the heart put back into us, and we will be healed if we properly resolve and deal with this hurt. And it will reveal my need for attention. I need to be tended to because I'm wounded. Wounded people, wounded animals, wounded plants need to be tended to. And so that's working my way. Those of you familiar with the feeling sheet, that's working my way to the right. Where harm occurs to me, or if I'm harming someone else, is when I get over into the territory of resentment and or revenge. You said the word vengeance earlier, Steph. Like when I move into the territory of seeking vengeance, of plotting the demise of someone else, when I get into the territory of making sure I'm meting out as much woundedness as I've received, then to be punished, then I know I'm in harm territory.
Yes. So when I'm not taking responsibility for the fact that I have felt hurt, and all of a sudden I want to pick something back up and throw it at the other person. They called me a name, so I'm going to call them a name, or they did this, so I'm going to do that. Now we're into resent, hurt, or resentment. And as soon as we start, as you said, we talked about right-hand column, as we move left into the impairments and resentment and vengeance, now we're in the territory of harming an individual, crossing boundaries, and and wounding them in such a way that it's not just hurt, it's causing harm. It's an intent to do ill to another person.
Yes. It's what, scripturally, there's so much talk, or a good bit of talk in the epistles about making sure we're keeping clean accounts with one another. And often it talks about keeping records of wrong, as 1 Corinthians 13. But then it talks about gossip in the church. What's so harmful about gossip is a person is being injured and they don't know they're being stabbed.
Mm.
And that's the harm. Mm-hmm. They're defenseless. They're both powerless and helpless because someone's saying something about them, whether it's true, whether the data is accurate or not. The harm in gossip is that someone is defenseless and being beaten with words.
Yes.
So it makes it harmful. And so that's that whole territory of seeking vengeance, or as you said, throwing the rock of resentment of hurt back at someone. The word literally means to damage the health of someone or to have an adverse effect on someone. It's actually a German root. And in the German, it means grief and sorrow. So it's related to, if I do something that causes someone to have to grieve loss they have received in a harmful way from me, if I've taken something from them, then I have caused harm. I'm back to that meaning of that root German word that means I've caused them great loss. I've taken something from them that's not mine.
Yeah. So once I've caused harm to someone, if I've caused harm to someone, and I have an internal experience myself that's called guilt. Like I've now done to somebody something that I would not have wanted to have done to me, and I go, oh my gosh, I have this thing inside of me that says I have caused harm, which then leads to this place of guilt, which will send me into place to repair rupture in relationship if I have that recognition of guilt. So the other feeling that comes across when we're talking about harm is around guilt, and that sense of, okay, I have done something that has caused harm to another, and now I need to go and repair rupture in this relationship. I think where things begin to get messy is like when people want to blame and go, well, you did this to me. And it's like relationships start getting really confusing, where it's like, did I do something? Did I not do something? What's the experience that's going on here? Or what I've seen a lot of in situations relationally is so many times that people have grown up in environments where they want to preserve relationship. So they end up apologizing for areas that they have not caused harm. And so they're just running around apologizing to save relationship, and trying to help people unwind that a little bit, to be like, hey, like if you haven't caused harm, don't be so quick to apologize, because what are you apologizing for?
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
No, the answer to that question is, it's a great question. And when I'm doing that, I'm apologizing for having an identity. Sick relationships, the rule is you're not allowed to have an identity with me. You can act in codependency. You can lie to me. You can curry favor with me. You can show favoritism to me. You can always agree with me. You can say things just right and tailor them exactly the way I demand you do that. But the minute you have something independent of me that I'm going to have feelings about, then you've hurt me, you've harmed me. Now you have to pay.
Yeah, so that's where kids grow up in an environment that if they have any sort of not pleasing somebody, that they just apologize. I'm sorry. And you're saying they're apologizing for having any identity that is separate from another person or doesn't match what that other person is. Yeah.
And part of a guy named Murray Bowen, a theorist, he calls it differentiation. Part of differentiation means that adolescents growing into young adulthood, it is necessary for healthy development for that child turning into a man or a woman to hurt the parents because it hurts to see them grow. We are so excited about Luke getting married next month. We love our daughter-in-law to be, and yet he's hurting us because she's getting a whole ton of his attention these days. and she needs to, and he's doing exactly what he needs to do. And we're moving back in line in our proper place, and he's having to say things and wedding planning that, you know how smooth that is. And we're working toward handling that well. And we've stubbed our toe, and he stubbed his, and she stubbed hers, and we've hurt one another. And then sometimes they, more so going from one of them to us, they've needed to say things to us that we feel hurt about because we've gotten out of line. We've moved into a place in line that's not ours.
Yeah.
So they've had to say to us, needed to stop. And our job is to stop. And so anytime we're developing as human beings, that, as Bowen called, that differentiation process is going on. And people are struggling to find having the same identity as a person, but a new role in someone's life. So that movement from having my identity, but moving into a new role, that's scary. And sometimes things have to be said that are hurtful. Most often when a boundary's set, the person who is setting it is afraid on some level of being harmed, and the person that it's set with will often feel hurt. There are all kinds of things in human experience and relationship that require us to handle hurt well.
Yes. And when, I mean, you said an important word there. When Luke tells you to stop, you feel hurt. If you did not stop, and this is where boundaries are so important, if you did not stop and you continued to step over that boundary that he set, now you're in the role of harm.
Yes.
Anytime that a boundary is set, that whole idea that we gain a self back, we have a sense of, where you end and somebody else begins. You start setting boundaries. The people that start stepping over those boundaries, they're creating that harm is happening. Or if you step over, or if I step over a boundary that's been set, then that's harm.
Yes. And we're kind of tagging off each other tonight, which is, I think, what this is supposed to be. But now that I think about it, what you're nudging up against there is when I am saying something that's hurtful, when I'm giving my friend Stephanie or my friend Tony feedback, I'm having a lot of feelings about that, because I may say something to you that you're going to feel hurt about, that I need you to know, because they're the wounds of a friend. I'm wounding you as a friend, or Tony, or you, me, or Tony with me. Some woundedness is happening. So I have a lot of feelings if I say something that is hurtful, because I'm putting myself out there vulnerably, giving you that feedback or asking you for what I need or setting that boundary. That's hurt. If I run over the boundary you're setting, you run over it, I'm moving further away from feelings. And that's mostly what harm does. I know I'm harming someone when I'm moving away from feelings and becoming invulnerable and more powerful. I'm probably in the territory of harming someone. If I'm teaching someone a lesson, punishing someone, jabbing someone, making sure they back up from me, making sure they don't ever say that to me again, those kinds of things, moving back into a place of power, I need to take a long look to make sure I'm not causing harm. Because hurt, any of those feelings, any of them, sadness, fear, anger, they're going to put me in a more vulnerable place. So if I'm giving feedback, when Sheila said that to me, when Luke was in the womb still, when Luke's giving me this feedback recently with wedding planning, when Dr. Nolan said that to me about, son, you're not going to be a doctor. They were putting themselves out there in a very vulnerable place. All three of those conversations, they were not harming me. But if they had raged at me or threatened me, or Dr. Nolan had made fun of me because I couldn't do math and science like he could and all that stuff, he would have been harming me, and he would have been in a position of much, much more power. But he was really putting himself out there vulnerably to say those things to me. I'm one of his students, and he's having to deliver some news to me that he wants me to know for my good.
Yes. So any of the left, what I hear you saying is, when we move to left-hand column, so when we are in resentment or toxic shame or shamelessness is the one that actually comes up bigger than toxic shame, and that is
Mm-hmm.
shamelessness is the harm in that, or rage or control, or that those all end up being about harm. So what happens like when two people end up in a conflict, husband and wife, like never happened, right? Um, when a husband and wife get into conflict, or friends get into conflict with one another, or coworkers, conflict happens. And somebody wants to blame the other person sits in a place of going, gosh, I don't know that that's what happened. Where do you go from there? Let's say that they don't have a backdrop of like even feelings work, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're teaching somebody to start having a self and not just run in and apologize, because that ends up making them take responsibility for something they may not have caused. Where do they go with that to know what to do?
So I generally yell louder and then occasional profanity. I found that's just really total joke.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's so helpful.
was so helpful. Well, we've also addressed this before, and this is another one of those things to where, gosh, if we just had this one, if we could this one concept, church relationships, marriage, of course, and all others, it is if we could first talk about how we're going to deal with this before we deal with what we're talking about, it would save a whole lot of grief, a whole lot of harm. Because
Say
so
more about
often
that.
it when I can double back, take a step back in a marital dispute or wherever it is, if I can take a step back and pay really close attention to what I'm feeling, I can pay close attention to what I'm experiencing with you or Tony or whoever, Sheila, whoever I'm talking to, and I can ask you to join with me in let's talk about how we're going to do this because I'm really angry or I'm really hurt, Stephanie, what you just said. I want to be sure we're being really clear before we get to what we're arguing about or what you're bringing to me, that I let you know where I am emotionally in this. When you said it that way, it was really hurtful. And I'm pretty scared right now. I just need to know where you are with me.
Yeah.
And your face may have said to me, limbic regulation, regulating off of your face. Your face may have said to me, you want to tear me to pieces and you're never going to love me again and you want to never see me again. But internally, you may be thinking about 100 other things you've got going on, and this is irritating the fire out of you, and you just
Yeah.
want to get this done.
Yeah.
And the stories are completely different. This is all about something happening over there in Lawrence somewhere. But if I'm looking at your face and I'm not talking about how we need to do this, I'll make up a story about you and you'll become my enemy, and we'll probably harm one another. I'll certainly harm you because I've got a story in my head that you hate me. And so we
Yeah.
just talk about where we are with one another on an emotional level. Then you may tell me, like, I got a million things going on at school and at work and at church and at wherever else, and I'm really preoccupied, and I probably just said that because I'm 1,000 other places right now too, Phil. And we go, oh,
So I
I
gotta you talk about what's going on with your internal world. I recognize what's going on in my internal world. I'm really scared. I've got a lot going on. I've got hurt because of this, or I'm sad, and I find that I'm speeding up. Like we start there, and from there, then we can talk about if we can proceed in conversation or not. Because I think that there's that place where if we start sniffing out much of left-hand column stuff or find ourselves speeding up, I know sometimes recovery calls, if you start speeding up and feeling more revved up internally, heart rate, that gut feeling, or just in the sense of moving to power, it's like you guys really, like anybody, there isn't a place to have a conversation yet. Not
yeah,
until that you two people can be present, because whether you want to say that you can't access the higher levels of your brain, whether you want to say your relational circuits are off. There's lots of different phrases that different recovery methods talk about those things. But literally, you're in fight, flight, freeze, or wavering on that line right there, and it's like, hey, you're gonna cause more harm if that's what's going on. And then I also recognize that sometimes that other person, the explosion happens or whatever happens between two people, that person goes off, and I'm left with myself to go, what just happened, and what's my responsibility? Because in my own relationship with me and me with God, I want to have clear conscience. And how do I walk this out with myself if that other person's not willing to show back up again? Or it may be some time before that person ever shows back up again. Or that other person may call and rage at me. And I'm left in a position going, oh, what's happening? What's happening? And so for me, with me, I have to go to a place of me with me, like what's my internal experience of what happened, and me with God, where it's like asking God to reveal to me my character defects that I'm aware of, and maybe me with another person who is a trusted other that I can talk to them about the situation. Because there are some situations in life where we can't, at least at that time, go back to this other person, especially if they're throwing fiery arrows at us to try and get clarity or try to share feelings that sometimes the other person isn't willing. And so there's still a path to move forward, regardless of whether that other person is willing to engage in that or not. And if I do find, oh yeah, there's this thing that I did, I do recognize that I've harmed the other person, there's a path that I can go with that and take account for how I've caused harm. And at that time, I may not be able to go to the other person with it. Like it may not be such that I can go to that other person. Or it can be a situation where it's like, man, I know that they're trying to blame me here, but I really, like with clear consciousness, you're like, I don't have a responsibility in this situation. Yeah. And then I maintain my relationship, me with me, and not run off and apologize to try and save a relationship. Because the first relationship that I abandoned when I apologize to try and make the relationship better, when I haven't caused harm, I abandoned myself. And then I beat myself up, and then I toxic shame myself or whatever else for a situation where I didn't cause harm. But I'm trying to save this relationship over here, and now I've caused the same abandonment with myself that I experienced a way long time ago. So all that to say, like, for me, it was very normal to struggle in this area of hurt and harm, because I wanted to rush in and make relationships better. And over time, I've gained more and more clarity of like, hey, what's mine here that I need to take account for? And how do I just show up and express my feelings? And if someone has hurt, how do I hear the hurt and be with them in the hurt and be with them in the other feelings as well, but not necessarily run in and fix anything.
Yeah. Those are, gosh, Stephanie, those are so important. So now that you're talking about it, it's easy to talk about when I have harmed someone and I make amends for that, like the brilliance of the 12 steps, the 9th step of making amends. It's a whole underworld, underbelly, understated territory around, hey, what if I haven't? But I've come up in this place to where if I have feelings or if I have an identity or if I set a boundary or if I disagree, I'm necessarily harming someone. I've taken that on and on and on. There are 3 really, if you really practice, I really mean this, if you practice relationally, there are 3 indicators. You'll recognize this, and those of you who are familiar with some of the work we do will recognize this off what we call the ladder lecture. But there are 3 indicators to answer that question that you just addressed around, hey, what do I need to do here? What amends do I need to make, if any? If you find yourself, or if I find myself being reactive rather than responsive, if I'm reacting, if I'm listening for what I'm hearing preparing to shoot back or shoot down or rebut or harm more, if I'm becoming reactive and everything I say is not, this reason I talked earlier about how we're going to talk about this, if everything I say is a reaction to what you have said, to red flag for me that I may be intending harm. So if I'm reactive and if I'm in competition, if when you and I are talking through something and one of us has hurt the other, and I'm being reactive, I'm watching you, listening to you in order to rebut what you say or keep you away from me. The second sign is if I'm in competition. If you say something and I can't rebut it effectively with data, but I find a way to tell you how wrong you are or push you back, push you away through competing with you, that's another sign. The third one is if I'm acting in independence. If I'm saying things that estrange you or alienate you, and I end up living in independence. So if I'm reactive, if I'm in competition with you, and if I'm living independent from you, not codependent on you, but if I'm living independent from you, if I'm my own, I got to take care of me. I can no longer pay attention to your needs or what you're saying or your feelings. I got to take care of me. So the best way I can take care of me is to throw rocks at you or push you away from me. So reactivity to only speak what is reactive to what you've said. Competition to make sure every word I speak is designed to get back on top of you, get back one up on that ladder on you. And if I'm independent, if I'm just covering me and no longer caring about you, those are three real strong indicators that I have or am harming you, not just hurting you.
Yeah. And do the flip side of those three, Phil,
Yeah.
so that like those are indicators that okay, I'm probably going to be in a place where I'm going to harm somebody. And then when you have three of the opposite of those, of when you are more present and still relational with someone.
Yeah, you can think of them in couplets. So the first one, reactivity. I get back to my own identity, what is going on here, and I move from reactivity to responding, or being to play on words. You've heard it before, response able. I'm able to respond, and then I move from competition to cooperation. If you break that word apart, co means two or more. Cooperation. We operate as human beings. So if I'm operating in my humanness and you're operating in yours, we are working in a cooperative relationship rather than competition. And so that gets back to that Steph, how are you and I going to resolve this? And you say to Tony to you, and I say to Sheila, and Sheila to me, how are we going to do this? That's that cooperation thing. Let's talk about how we do it so we don't harm one another. And then moving from independence to dependence, dependent on God and depending on the strength of our relationship to be able to resolve this effectively. There's a couple of CPE guys on here that I see, and on the list here, a fine Canadian just joined us. And so these guys know that when we go into process group, I would often say, like, if your relationship can't support hurt, you don't have much. I'm not talking about harming. Process group at CPE got the reputation of being the Wild West, and it did get crazy at times for sure. But the purpose of that group, Canadian flag. I guess who the Canadian is, Drizzle. So we would go into group, and like, even though it got wild and all that stuff, sometimes like the purpose of the group was not to be the Wild West. The purpose of the group was to do what you and I are talking about. Let's maintain our own identities. Let's work together, not defeating one another, but confronting one another, maybe even hurting one another, but doing so without harm. So we're going to process what we're saying, and we're going to process how we're saying it. Because it gets back to what is the limbic resonance in this room, in this circle, and in the treatment center setting. How is the limbic resonance back at the house or back at the apartment? And what are these faces? What faces are you regulating off of, and what in your story comes up? And that's another big thing we probably need to hit on. Like when I'm deciding between hurt and harm and what's happening here, my understanding of those two words can come a whole lot from my story.
What you're talking about earlier, when you're like, when you start making up stories about what's going on with me, if you haven't asked that situation and you just started assigning motive, that all of that stuff from motive or living in other people's heads comes from our own story. So in that place of, hey, can I be aware of my own story and what hurt and harm has been around my own story, so that I
Mm-hmm.
don't start assigning motive? Because if I assign motive to another person, I'm causing harm, or and there's some things like being able to be present when someone is having feelings, to me, took practice in a safe environment, because I think for most people, the idea of confrontation in the beginning was someone's going to be harmed, kill or be killed. You're like in that reactionary place and you're in competition, and you better defend yourself well, because if you didn't, you're going to die. And so you better, better figure out how to be tough in this situation. And so some of this for me, in learning when someone was sharing their feelings, just sharing their feelings with me, it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
Steph, you're not being threatened. I'm okay. There's nothing bad happening. Like there's almost an underlying self-talk that was happening, to sit knee to knee with somebody across from me as they're doing confrontation, and a little bit of self-regulation going on, so that I can remain present when somebody is sharing their feelings. Because
Mm-hmm.
almost immediately, if somebody is sharing feelings, it's like, I'm bad, I'm wrong, better defend myself, better justify,
Mm-hmm.
better all these things. And we end up derailed almost immediately, instead of being like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, can I remain present with this other person? Can I believe the best about this other person? Can they remain present with me and me with them? And then believe that they're my ally, and hear them. And if there's a deeper discussion that has to happen, we can do that. But so much of this work around hurt and harm for me has been recognizing for myself, always, like what we talk about, like what is going on with me, so I can remain present with another person.
Yes.
you know and so it is a little bit about what's happening with them, but so much of it internally is what's happening with me.
Mm-hmm.
What am I experiencing? What am I feeling?
And that brings us back to that secret sauce, I guess you would say, of relationship. Can I tolerate my feelings as other people are having theirs?
Yeah.
And if I can, I am well on the way to being even open to asking the question, is what I'm about to say or what I just said harmful?
Yeah. Yeah. And can I tolerate being with somebody else and their feelings, and
Mm-hmm.
not take their feelings from them either? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the beautiful
Mm-hmm.
beginnings of relationship. Yeah. So, guys, we're going to wrap up a little bit early tonight. And so, if there are other questions that you guys have around hurt and harm, feel free always to reach out. You can send a message through Instagram. Or if there's ever a topic that you want to talk about, Phil and I to talk about more in depth, we do this. So, we try to do this the third Tuesday of every month. And so feel free to ask questions, send comments, and I'll send this link out to the people that are on my email list, for people that want to share it out later as well. And we'll probably do this again next month. Reminder, we have a workshop coming up in Lawrence, Kansas, the 25th and 26th of March. Our last one is full. And what I try to remind people is, hey, please don't wait until the last minute to sign up. And we can roll from there. If you want to sign up or learn more about our workshop, you go to be-sent.life. And until we get to see you guys again, take care, and we'll talk to you later.
See
Bye.
y'all.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.